Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome. Could you silence your cell phones first? If I don't ask you now, we'll forget. So let's all do that. Thank you. Let me first introduce the Dean of the College of Humanities, Mary Wilder Bassett, who would say a few words for the beginning of this event. Please.
Thank you all very much. I'm very, very happy to see you all here again. My name is Mary Wilder Bassett. It's my privilege to serve as the Dean of the College of Humanities and to be very involved in that way with Confluence. So we thank Confluence especially for this wonderful event and to welcome Professor Spivak here. We're very excited about this talk. I won't keep us from that, but again, welcome to all of you. Thank you. Great thanks to Confluence, and especially heartfelt welcome on the part of the College of Humanities. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dean Wilder Bassett. I am Javier Duran. I'm the director of the Confluence Center. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. And first, a couple of reminders. We will have a question and answer after the lecture. And we have microphones here, 2 microphones here in the front of the aisles. You can also send your questions via Twitter at #Spivak. And we will also have a live reception at the College of Architecture Gallery right across the street next to the Center for Creative Photography. You're all welcome to join us. Now, I want to thank the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the College of Humanities for helping to make this visit possible. My gratitude also to the able staff from the Office of the Vice President of Research, and a special thanks to the Confluence Center team, Maria Telles, Willie Costley, Yvonne Irving, Kurt Fell, and Elaine Godoy for their hard work. Please give them a hand. It is an honor and a privilege to have here with us today Professor Gayatri Spivak. She earned her PhD in 1967 from Cornell and is now a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University, where she has earned the institution's highest rank of university professor. Her overriding ethical political concern has been the tendency of institutional and cultural discourses practices to exclude and marginalize the subaltern, especially subaltern woman. The late critic Edward Said once wrote that, quote, "She pioneered the study and literary theory of non-Western women and produced one of the earliest and most coherent accounts of that role available to us," end of quote. The publication of her influential piece, Can the Subaltern Speak, in 1988, created a vigorous intellectual synergy that has had tremendous effects in academia. Now in 2012, the question is still valid, and perhaps a spin on the question could be, can the subaltern know thyself? Or in a place like Tucson, Arizona, in 2012, in January of 2012, can we ask the same question in a different way? Can the subaltern read itself? Much could be said about her work, but now allow me to contextualize her visit to Tucson. During the MLA convention in Philadelphia in 2006, MLA's president Michael Holquist called a meeting to think about themes and speakers for the next convention. As people provided input, the native Mexican intellectual Carlos Monsiváis emerged. And it was Professor Spivak advocating an invite. I mentioned that the University of Arizona had just presented him, Monsiváis, with an honorary doctorate. We agreed then to invite him to the Chicago convention the following year. I became the mediator and managed to organize a panel. I was very fortunate to have had a very good relationship with Carlos Monsiváis. As our exchange moved forward, Monsiváis was both thrilled and concerned that such an illustrious academic, Spivak, would think of him as a border scholar, or as a scholar at all, and not as what he considered himself to be, a social voyeur. We all gathered in Chicago in December 2007, and the panel, which included our colleagues, was a success. Mutual admirers of their work, Gayatri met Carlos, and it seemed like this would be a promising and lasting relationship. We then agreed that the next meeting should take place at the border or near the border. I suggested Tucson. They both agreed. Monsiváis made his way to Tucson first in 2005, and then the University of Arizona, as I mentioned, awarded him an honorary degree in 2006. Spivak, meanwhile, was very busy. She was working hard on her planetary agenda, honoring multiple commitments worldwide. The meeting in Tucson had to wait. Monsiváis continued his frenetic work, observing, critiquing, writing, collecting art and popular culture, objects, memories, images, and also watching in horror how the right, now in power, was post-globalized in Mexico. Then his health declined. The omnipresent Monsi was seen less and less in public. His body was affected. A respiratory illness limited his mobility. In the summer of 2010, Carlos Monsiváis passed away in Mexico City. A terrible loss for humanity. One of the most brilliant public intellectuals of the 20th century was gone. The MLA Chicago panel was entitled Migrations Across Planetarities, Transbordering Citizenships, and the Public Intellectual from South, North, and Beyond. The framing question was, how are the humanities dealing with these contemporary issues worldwide? As the topic of the session centered on migrations, it also questioned the inability or undesirability of the globalized state to properly intervene. That is, the globalized states are reconfiguring all forms of literal borders in order to control and secure their peripheral spaces. Yet, we were concerned about the ideological elements in this puzzle. Thus, while there is a lot of rhetoric about free trade, international cooperation, and a global economy, concrete actions resulting from concrete policies were impacting the way migratory flows were being dealt by northern global states. I must say that at the time, Monsiváis was also engaged in a fierce critique of Samuel Huntington's book, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. Hence, we discussed how the racisms of globalization and the globalization of racism were key elements neglected by the state in current migration flows and conversations. The panel was really inspired by Chapter 3 of Gayatri Spivak's book, Death of a Discipline, a series of lectures she gave at UC Irvine in 2000, where she presents and discusses the notion of planetarity, which defies and resignifies the question of who are we? The planetarity of which, and I'm quoting Spivak, the planetarity of which I have been speaking in these pages is perhaps best imagined from the pre-capitalist cultures of the planet. It is such a collectivities that must be opened up with the question, how many are we? End of quote. As the Confluence Center project emerged last year, I contacted Professor Spivak wondering if she would come to Tucson as part of our project's inaugural speaker series. She became immediately interested in coming. We agreed that it was important to acknowledge Monsiváis' memory and his work. Hence, Confluence Center will initiate efforts to create the Carlos Monsiváis Confluence Professorship. This professorship would allow us to bring a renowned public intellectual, scholar, or artist to the U of A campus for a period of time. We intend not only to honor Monsiváis' legacy, but to create a space where creative inquiry can in fact flow north and south. Thank you, Professor Spivak, for helping us to honor Carlos Monsiváis' memory and for accepting to participate in our project. Your time and generosity are really appreciated. And now please help me welcome Gayatri Spivak.
I am deeply honored to be asked to speak in the name of Carlos Monsiváis. He was a very modest man, and he was also an ironic man, so part of what he said to Javier was undoubtedly a joke. I mean, The way in which actually once I considered, I didn't know him at all well. I met him once, and then, of course, the meeting never could become a friendship, as it undoubtedly would have become. But the reason why I felt very close to his work was because he, like me, actually spoke from both sides of borders, and he was also deeply autocritical, not just personally, but in terms of his space, which is the strongest position for making changes for social justice. I remain a citizen of India. I'm not Indian American, and so I know this rather well. I do work also in India. I have been for the last 25 years, in fact, trying in the Gramscian way and in a very humble way to produce what Gramsci called the subaltern intellectual among the poorest sectors of the electorate. I have no web page because I don't really need any kind of support from anybody except my own skills and people I can get to do this kind of training. It's very hard to get enthusiasm, yes, but real capacity, it's very hard to get this kind of, do this kind of challenging work. And as a citizen of India, of the Republic of India, I'm deeply critical of the country. The citizen has a right to be critical, just as someone who has worked full-time at a university for 45 years in the United States, I'm also deeply critical with few civil rights, since I have a 50-year-old green card, which is, especially for an Asian female, this is supposed to be somewhat arrogant. And I was discussing yesterday that this is also class fixed. If I were indeed not of the academic middle class, it would be very difficult for me to remain in this stance, and I'm quite aware of that. But as such, I'm also deeply critical of the United States, because I've had thousands of US students. So that was a joke, eh? But I mean, I identify, all right? So this is what bound me to Carlos Monsiváis's work. He, if I could just quote him, when he says, for most of the Mexican century, the border with the United States, of course, he says, marked a limit of hope and a peak of anachronism for those living on the other side. This has changed in an extraordinary way. So he was actually looking at it from both sides, and as I say, he was deeply autocritical, and I find this to be interesting and good. At any rate, to go on then, first of all, I want to say that I have come here to learn. I accepted the invitation because the situation in Arizona is such that really everybody in the United States has to learn in detail what's going on here. And we in New York live in a culture of fear, and this fear that the fact that this entire territory was in fact Mexico, this idea, this fear that there will be some kind of reclaiming, it is unjustified. But nonetheless, basically, this is, I call it the Israel phenomenon, that for something written in some kind of a religious text hundreds and thousands of years ago with different kinds of geographical markers somehow allows you to come in and occupy. This has bred a kind of fear that in this case is completely unjustified. And Carlos Monsiváis knew that too. The problem is not that anybody, this is the terror, that Mexico is going to take over the Mexican Americans because they have been through the civilizing mission. They have been really made into people who can do it. They are going to really take over. But this is absurd. That's not what's happening here. So therefore, I felt I needed to learn more. How do I know that I needed to learn more? Because it's not the first time that a bill has been introduced in Congress. It was also introduced against Edward Said, because it was declared that through his teachings he had affected foreign policy, United States foreign policy, by breeding up through Middle Eastern Studies institutes, through his work. He had bred up people who were un-American, and therefore there was a bill introduced which suggested that Middle Eastern studies should be curtailed, rewritten, and so on and so forth. So in that context, I felt, in the broader context, how is it that I don't know more detail? And so the only way that I could do it was by forcing myself into a position of having to address what looks like a very large crowd. So thank you for giving me the learning opportunity. At this point in time, I do not have any other opportunities to learn. I'm not allowed, in fact, to take time off to learn. So that's really my agenda. And I identify with Carlos Monsiváis. I told you why. Also, what I wanted to do then was also introduce, you see, Javier has given me 40 minutes, 45 minutes max. I actually want to talk about it for 2 or 3 hours. You're very grateful that I've been censored. So to an extent, you know, I'm just going to make some points and then let me flesh it out through your questions and answers. So the point that I really want to make is that this business of wanting to take over and so on, which is just a feature of the other side's paranoia and fear, which has turned this place into, I mean, I couldn't believe when I actually looked at the Senate bill, I couldn't believe what an unbelievable sort of state terrorist situation was being created here. The talk about subaltern, the so-called sans-papiers, I will not call them undocumented, I will call them paperless, I will not call them illegal. Those are the subalterns, right? And I look at gendered subalterns also. And for a very long time, see, I'm trying to place this in a broader context as I'm trying to learn. For a very long time, since 1994, when the United Nations actually opened the NGO forum in Cairo in the name of population control and development, we have been fighting against identifying the woman as only the womb. And to an extent, if you look at this picture in a gendered way, this incredible, you see, I don't know what happens in this state, but I can tell you how it reverberates in New York. The incredible idea that women from elsewhere come here simply as instruments of dropping children, so that they will have, you see, this idea of, you know, it's like Godzilla. I mean, what do they think human beings are? So that they can drop children who will become natural Americans. This is a tremendous sort of gendered side of this entire culture of terror. What is happening here? You know, of course, there is no way that I could be anything but completely with Unidos. What is, you know, the idea of taking books away from readers, the idea of taking something that is part of the core into electives. There is no teacher who has her head screwed right who could actually approve of this. So that's just simply bottom line. That's not part of, I'm not even arguing that one. But what is it that is actually being stopped in this way? It's not a question, and this is why, with Carlos Monsiváis, one has to look at it from both sides of the border. It is not a way, it is not an identitarian thing that is being stopped. The other side thinks that's what it is, pure identitarianism. In fact, what is happening, I want to make this point again and again, and I want to put it in a broader context. In fact, what is happening is that what was a performative is being transformed into performance. That's what it means for material to be introduced into curricula, and it's being stopped. That's what it means for materials to be introduced into museums. That's what it means for material to be available to the polity. And my example here, which is why I said I'm trying to see it in a broader context with Said, but my example here is W.E.B. Du Bois. I was speaking on the 5th of December, I believe, to my own so-called identity group, South Asians, in Seattle. And I spoke there at great length on Du Bois. I'm not going to here. But the reason why I spoke there at great length on Du Bois was precisely because he was not a South Asian author. And I was suggesting to them that what they should do now is try to transform what is no longer their performative into performance for the general culture, which is what Du Bois was doing in the best-known book, Souls of Black Folk. Let me explain myself a little more. And in fact, I should also say that I first learned to think this way from the Walpiri West Australian Aboriginals. The idea of moving a performative into performance. And let me dwell on this for just a little while. The idea there was, with the Walpiri, the idea was that they had, and this is in my book, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, that they had, in fact, quote, lost their language, unquote, all right? Now, by this was not meant that they actually were no longer capable of speaking in their language. No. It was a metaphor used by them, a very powerful metaphor. What it meant was that within the modern polity, they could not, and indeed to an extent, they were not just kind of nostalgic golden ageists. This is where Monsiváis and I congratulate them. They did not particularly want to be anthropologized and museumized. What they wanted was to change what was their software, their cultural software, as it were, the performative, what made the culture move so that people felt, you know, when you're in a culture, you feel that it's human nature. That's the thing. It's not like anthropologists or culture studies folks studying culture. It's good, you should study cultures. But when you begin to study cultures, culture is somewhere else running, because it's always on the run, culture alive. And so, I mean, people sometimes have said, even in print, well, Gayatri Spivak, you know, apparently there was some kind of a gay costume party in San Francisco, I was told by Jean Franco's nephew, where somebody dressed as Gayatri Spivak. So Jean asked him, how did they dress as Gayatri Spivak? So they wear a butch haircut and combat boots and a sari. Now, the thing is, somebody has even written that this is how, you know, I kind of betrayed the culture. That is not so. I'm Indian. Whatever I do is Indian. So, you know, it's when you want to be anthropologized, then you wear the right kind of shoes that the other who's looking at you like an anthropological unit thinks is appropriate. So to that extent, as long as white Western folks can wear their little nose rings, I can certainly wear combat boots, because it's, you know what I'm saying? It's because we assume that one kind of cultural practice is the performative, the software in the computer, human nature, etc. It's because of that that we, in fact, cannot assume that other kinds of so-called cultures is not just a way of determining you so that you become an example of cultural performance. This is what the Walpiri in Australia taught me. They were going to move from this because in contemporary Australia, this was no longer their software, computer software, performative in the culture. Because the original definition of performative, which was produced by the British philosopher J.L. Austin, was that it was a way of using words whereby the words would do things rather than simply describe things. When can words do things? When there is a very strong cultural convention in place. Otherwise, words can't do things. So when this thing moves away from the oppressed-dominated culture, then the Walpiri in West Australia taught me then it is time to move that material into curricula, make it compulsory in schools. Then it is time, because it's part of the general Australian culture. It's not just a part of a completely broken and defeated performative of a small group in Australia. And God knows Mexican Americans are not a small group here in Arizona. But nonetheless, therefore, this idea of changing the performative into performance so that it's available for the general culture, this is why when Du Bois wrote Souls of Black Folk at the beginning of the last century, he actually said in the post phase that most of its readers would be white. So to an extent, I'm not going to give the reading. I hope some of you will read the reading. It's in not this book that's just coming out, but it's in a piece that's coming out in India, so God knows when you'll read the reading, but I hope. There is a reading that I carry through in terms of the epigraphs in the Souls of Black Folk, where I try to show how Du Bois, with his rhetorical expertise, was actually moving the reader, the generally white reader, as he said, through this move. And that's what is fearful for the culture of fear, that this performative, which is on the other side of the state, changing also in another way, and the other side of the border, changing in another way, is actually being made part of the general performance of the culture. That's what's leading to all of these efforts. So number one, there is the fear, the Israel syndrome, this kind of reversed Israel syndrome, that there is some sort of desire to replay a history. And Carlos Monsiváis spoke derisively of this at NYU, that there is some kind of fear that there'll be a takeover. You know, I live in Washington Heights, which is the western side of Spanish Harlem, right? It's mostly Dominican, and when I don't wear Indian clothes, I'm always taken to be a Hispanic, which is fine. It was true also in Texas when I taught there. And you know, I'm mi amor all the time. And so the thing is, that's fine. And so more Spanish is spoken in where I live than English is. But that is not a desire for a takeover. These folks are, in fact, adding, I live near the huge Hispanic Society Museum. This is an attempt to not even acknowledgement of diversity, but to, because diversity is kind of a strange word, but don't get me on it, I will never keep within 45 minutes, but the idea of actually making it part of the performance of the general culture, that's what is scary. So to an extent, that was part of the point that I wanted to make today. Number one, then, where does the fear come from? Number two, what is being resisted is the desire to change a cultural performative into a general cultural performance, although this is often not recognized as such. But that's fine. You know, it's fine if one understands this as something else, because the way to proceed when you're a student is not always to be able to diagnose exactly what's happening. That's what we oldies are for. That's why Monsiváis and I could talk together, could think together, even when we didn't know each other. That this deeply autocritical sense of different kinds, I want to move to my next point, different kinds of minoritization. The way in which the Mexican American is minoritized here, and within that group, the minoritized are the subalterns, actually reflects subalternization. Javier talked about how to redo the "can the subaltern speak" idea. Something that Gramsci didn't know about, couldn't think about, was that it is possible to actually institute subalternization. Antonio Gramsci, from whom the word comes, what is his definition of the subaltern? His definition, classic definition, second paragraph of the note on the history of the subaltern classes. His definition is the subaltern groups, the subaltern classes, are people who are not within the state, who cannot achieve the state. In other words, distanced from whatever structures the state has to support its citizens. So what we are witnessing today in general, as the New Deal is being broken up since 1983, is the dismantling of the welfare state, the subalternization of the middle class in general. I know whereof I speak. I'm from New York, right? 99% against 1%. And within that, this minoritization of the Mexican American, an added terror, I mean, border patrol everywhere. Within that, these 3,000 kilometers of border, this is actually a special enclave within this general subalternization. This is the effort to minoritize a majority in this area. And within that, of course, the added subalternization is the Senate bill, the House bill for the change from performative to performance. That's how one understands what's happening. Now, how does one actually confront this? I've been looking very carefully because I asked Javier to send me some stuff, and some stuff I have assembled on my own. I've been looking very carefully at the beautiful cultural material and celebrations put together by APALS, is that the name? And the political association, the Popular Artists Association for a Cultural Offensive. I've been looking at that. And they have written the Canto Vivo have written a very nice thing about the children of the future. The children of the future. And if I can find the piece of paper where I printed this out, then I can actually read it, but I actually know what they said, so I can also say it. They are saying in their note that talking about the children of the people, as they are talking about the young people who will want not to work for the world, which is only about capital inflow and outflow, which is only about greed, they're saying that our young people will want to go away from this system. Now, this idea, I have found it so I can actually read it. Young people who seek to break with the established, in English translation, children of the people, they write, simple but brave, bold and unhappy, questioning and optimistic, but especially young people who seek to break with the established diagrams of the market system to contribute to building a just and equitable society from the perspective of popular art and its obligations to the people. Now, I would like to suggest here that if indeed there are young people who seek to break with the established diagrams of the market system, then we also have to think of the ways in which globalization is different from post-colonial. See, I'm an Indian. I was born in British India. For me, the notion of a huge place that was owned by a whole group of people only in the 18th and 19th centuries and then taken over, for me, unfortunately, that does, I mean, in spite of Monsiváis's good sense, that does speak in a way, in terms of my personal history. I'm thinking about Gandhi and Nehru and so on, but that was in the 20th century. That was early in the 20th century. That's a different kind of ballgame, territorial imperialism. We are not there. Monsiváis is right. I'm wrong. I'm just thinking nostalgically of my own life. But if you look at globalization, what you have to admit is that Mexico is in the group of 20. you have to look at that, and you have to realize that this is not not only is it not a question of identity politics. I hope some of you will read the piece that I've written for the occupiers in the current title called What is to be Done, quite deliberately throwing a gauntlet at Lenin's thing, because vanguardism is not the answer. But at any rate, we have to realize that everywhere, the reason why the Mexican economy bit the dust was not because it was not committed, the government was not committed to the inflow and outflow of financial capital turning around and around, selling risks to the poor, so that it could actually, it turns over many more times in a day than does world trade today. You know, the difference in currencies, foreign exchange, that's the trade. So that the borders have to be kept up. I'll come to the borderless world idea in a minute. So in that situation, Mexico bit the dust, and this, I'm not saying this, economists say this, economists who are on our side, because most of the inflow stuff that came, inflow capital, was short-term capital. That was also a kind of minoritization because, of course, of the currency difference. I'm not going to explain this, but if young people want, in fact, to be concerned with living beyond just the diagrams set by the market, which is simply today, the state is managerial, the state manages global capital, they're simply today committed to allowing this kind, now that the investment banks and the commercial banks were collapsed in 1999, so that there is now no accountability for investment people toward anybody within the savings scene. In that kind of situation, the only commitment is to this kind of inflow and outflow of capital as often as possible, taking advantage of the difference among the hard currencies and between the hard currencies and soft currencies. So capital is in fact borderless. That's the problem. On the other hand, capital has to keep borders alive in order for this kind of cross-border trade to happen. So therefore, the idea of borderlessness has a performative contradiction within it, which has to be kept alive. This is also a problem with this terrorizing of Arizona, turning it into this kind of a border situation. Because, in fact, capital cannot do without. You know this. This is a performative contradiction. It cannot do without the incredible absence of workplace safety regulations, no labor laws, etc. I know the Senate bill says be a vigilante society, let everybody be captured. The illegal employer also has to show the 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. But in fact, the open secret is that it would be hard not to have the managerial state on the one side and on the other side this kind of technique which is in fact running the world today. And young people should keep this in mind, because as long as I do think that the cultural question of turning the performative into performance is very important and should go on. But as long as we think that mere golden ageism, that era is past, is going to be able indeed to make our children opt for a world where the diagram of the market is not everything that drives. Mere golden ageism is not going to do it. The real thing is, which is why I'm so interested in something like creative inquiry, the real goal is not even electoral politics, because the capacity of the Constitution to withstand some kind of real inquiry has been completely decimated within this kind of position where look at the fact that states tried all through the 80s, all through the 90s, in fact, all through the teens, to fight to keep some kind of regulation. I'm not talking about Arizona. But the federal government, in fact, absolutely refused to comply with them. Why? Because the government is sold to this movement, this kind of capital movement. So to an extent, what we're talking about is not electoral politics, not, in fact, identifying with only your enforced minoritization, but something much bigger, which can, in fact, be turned around to help us. Because remember, the performative contradiction of global capital needs that the Mexican Americans and the not yet Mexican Americans stay here. Not under the terms that they want, but nonetheless, there is that performative contradiction which you turn around in order to be able to work. How? By creating an educated electorate that is not taken in by any kind of metaphorical stuff being passed over as truth. If you wanted me to, but that's a 2-hour speech, I could here talk about white mythology and so on and so forth, but I don't want to go into those kinds of theoretical mysterious thickets of the relationship between metaphor and logic and so on. Let that stand. Believe me, you take me on trust. I can do it, but I'm not going to do it now. So I'm going to simply keep with the old-fashioned contrast, okay? These metaphors of creating jobs, these metaphors of identity, heritage, because I'll tell you one thing. One of the, and I don't know this, the Mexican politics also, of course, is this kind of political economy, but I'm speaking now about India. The idea, because there I have experience, the idea that post-colonials give back in this kind of a situation is a very frightening idea when it comes to investment. You should question these ideas of heritage, these metaphors of heritage, giving back, creating jobs, and so on and so forth. These are very scary metaphors. What we need in our children is an educated electorate with a will to social justice for all. And one can only remain in the position of creating such an electorate by, and I take this phrase absolutely to heart, creative inquiry, not an inquiry that produces nothing but the expected answers. I mean, you know, I'm trying to speak in a way so that I don't give you only the answers you expect from me, and you will certainly never hear from me just some kind of call for redress against minoritized South Asians. No, because and this is Monsiváis, we are not just a minority. We are also the world's largest democracy, says CNN, just as Mexico is a member of the Group of 10. We have to think about the fact that minoritization is also part of this metaphorical blackmail that is visited on an electorate that, even when educated, is sold into varieties of golden ageism and nostalgia. We, as people of color living in the United States, and some of us Americans, we really have to understand that those kinds of, we cannot give back to the terrorizers, the state terror, we cannot give back what they expect, which is that we are identitarians. We absolutely cannot. We must, this is where, again, Carlos Monsiváis and I are together. We have to acknowledge that what we are doing has to do with the general culture. This is also somewhat known and is part of the terror, but it is not a takeover. It is a situation, if you look again at that statement from the artists, the Canto Vivo, it is a situation of nurturing people, young people, who seek to break with the diagrams of the market system. In other words, who seek to have a world where there is a general will to social justice for all, rather than this insane, seductive commitment to just make. Why are the banks bailed out? Because even when people are suffering, everybody can see that, they must have enough money so that this investment circuit can continue, this inflow-outflow circuit can continue through securitization, you name it, unabated, so that the volume, the transaction volume, can remain, in fact, undisturbed. So we have to keep in mind that that's what we are fighting, because that is what finally will kill the culture, trivializing creative inquiry, trivializing the teaching of the humanities, trivializing the core by taking away things that are important in this state, Mexican studies, trivializing this kind of cultural endeavor. This is how, in fact, we are going to be left with people who will say social networking is democratic but will not have the mind to really use social networking creatively. We must not forget that the big telecommunication systems like China Mobile or Deutsche Telekom, they were the first actually to privatize, break away from the state and become borderless. So we have to acknowledge that when we talk about border studies, we have to acknowledge that there is a certain kind of borderlessness at work in the globalized world today and has been at least since the 80s, if not longer. Interest in international networks of this sort, it came up in the mid-19th century. And this borderlessness is, after all, a borderlessness which requires, to repeat, which requires that borders be there, so that the difference between the global north and global south and within the global north be kept alive. Unless we actually see our world in this way, all discussions of borders remain phenomenal, affective, and so on. There is something much more crucial going on. On the other hand, we also have to be able to dream of the other kind of borderlessness, unconditional hospitality. And I will, since I'm already on the 40-minute mark, alas, just one last thing. If I had read, it would have been an hour and a quarter, but I think that would have been a mistake. So let me end with a story, borderlessness. There must be people in this room. I know there are a couple who are roughly as old as I am and were involved with the anti-Vietnam War movement. During that time, you remember that Phil Oakes, the Texas boy, had a wonderful song called "I Declare the War is Over." And Phil Oakes, and the war was by no means over, and when Phil Oakes actually talked about this song, what he said was, this is a futuristic song. And I'll tell you what he meant. You know, he was not theoretically educated, and anyway, it was not the time when we had the theoretical language to actually say what he needed to say. A futuristic song. I declare the war is over. I declare, that's a declarative, that's not the future tense, that's a simple present. But at any rate, the idea there was what theoretically is called the mode of to come. It's always around the corner. The performative, if we are creating a new performative now, this performative of young people, again quoting Canto Vivo, who seek to break with the established diagrams of the market system, if we are trying to create this one, we have to think about it in the way in which performatives should be thought about, always doable, never quite there, okay? This is the mode of to come. The avenir in French, since, you know, high theory, you need a little French. So this is what the Texas boy was talking about when he said this is a futuristic song. And in that mode, we have to say, we declare the world is borderless. And in that sense, we have to then look at the ways in which, you know, the New York Times wrote in an editorial last Sunday. They talked about the fact that the union movement is against any kind of redress that the Obama administration is trying to take against this kind of terrorizing of immigrants. And what the New York Times said in a very broad and somewhat abated context was that the union is looking at all immigrants as criminals and drug lords, all criminals, all immigrants. That's what the union is looking at them as, and they're not acknowledging that, in fact, I mean, this is their language. I mean, this is not how I would describe it. But when I was thinking of this, that the union movement, which is, after all, labor. I mean, they're threatened. Of course they're threatened. Why? Because the union movement is not as savvy as global capital. Global capital is going to work in other ways. Remember what I said? The contradiction, they are needed. So the union movement, needed in the worst way, the union movement is saying that they're all criminals and they're refusing to sign, or they're refusing to enter the discussion. And I was thinking about, again, you know, I'm Indian. I think post-colonial. I'm not yet able to think global, although I'm trying, as you can see. I was thinking of the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, when, in fact, the British government decided that all Indians of certain kinds of Aboriginal, not us, not caste Hindus, we were okay, but we were colonial subjects, we were the rising middle class, we were fine. I mean, we were somewhat racist against us, I mean, you know, like entering clubs and going on streets, etc., nothing big. But those, I mean, that is a joke, of course, but those guys and women, the criminal tribes, they were by nature criminal. You understand? So think about it. When I say that what we have to really do is listen to this Canto Vivo folks and prepare creative inquiry for preparing an educated electorate with a will to social justice rather than simply self-interest, then you begin to think about how it is that it's the union movement that's doing what the British government did to the tribals, in it saying that they are natural criminals. All of them are criminals. Think about it a little, okay? This is why Desmond Tutu said apartheid didn't just begin with laws. These are deeply ingrained mindsets. And when I say educated electorate, I'm talking about mindset change as it happens in the humanities. It's not giving information. It's a very slow work of inculcating the intuitions of democracy as a habit, right? And it can only happen if these curricular censorships do not operate. So therefore, I would say, in closing, how long have I spoken? 25 and 15, 35. No, I'm getting there, okay? So this is my closing, okay. Although I applaud very, very much, believe me, I'm totally with him, the thing that Tom Sheridan wrote, Attack on Mexican-American Studies is short-sighted. And he talked about the sleeping giant of Arizona politics, the median age 25, 30.8%. Hispanics grew from 25.3 to 30.8, etc. Although I very much appreciate this kind of fighting capital with their own weapon, and it's necessary to do so, I feel that there will emerge from the madrasas, not of terror, but of justice. And you know, we are those schools that teach the will, that develop the will to social justice for all, this sleeping giant of Arizona politics, not just people, as he is suggesting, not just people who will be able to help with the capitalizing work of the United States, that there will be, this is not the only reason why, in fact, the attack on Mexican-American studies is short-sighted, because they are future Americans in the American way. No doubt they are, and I'm not against that. Like I said, I've had thousands of US students, and I mean, after all, I teach in New York, a very powerful elite university, global classroom, and so on and so forth. So I don't really have the right to be fighting this. But my hope is that it will be more than this, which will, and that's why I want to remain with Unidos. There will be more than this that will come out of restoring the core, and I believe the core will be restored. I believe the more you educate people like me in what is happening, and I took this opportunity, remember, to learn. And so, and in fact, if I had spoken, you know, I don't usually do this, but I'm actually taping myself, because I want these disorganized words to be transcribed so that I can organize them into something that will be more responsible. But the more you bring people, and I hope this professorship will do so, the more you bring people in from outside. You know, I tell you one little story. I was invited by the government of Bolivia right after Evo Morales became president, a subaltern became president. Okay, subalternity can be brought to crisis. By the vice president, who was a bourgeois Marxist, because he realized that in order for the referendum to go in the direction of the Morales regime, he needed intellectuals from all over the world to come and speak about the world as seen from Bolivia. So he invited me, he invited Tony Negri, he invited Ernesto Laclau, he invited people of that sort, and the referendum passed. I don't know what our contribution was, but with the vice president sitting there being my respondent, there were 5,000 people in the room. So the point was not that I was so brilliant that I could say something. The real point was that when people saw that the world at large, intellectuals in the world at large, had this feeling about what was happening in Bolivia. I, even as an old professor, corrected the vice president on his use of the phrase revolutionary epoch and so on. But that's as it may be, I'm an idiot. So this idea of this professorship is a very fantastic idea, because I think through this, what you can do is educate the larger world into, it's not just enough for Noam Chomsky to support this. It's necessary for Noam Chomsky to be able to, this is what a literary critic does, to be able to try to put himself in the shoes of the general subject who is moving all of this here in Arizona. And this will happen if this professorship, this Monsiváis professorship, really brings in people. I congratulate the university in thinking about this. And again, let me end right on the dot. Let me end by expressing my deep gratitude that I was honored to speak on the occasion of the inauguration of the professorship. Thank you. Was that okay? Because I didn't read anything, so because it would have taken too long.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions, and I would ask you to come to the microphones. There are 2 microphones here in front. And I also want to thank you for being here. I know some of you need to leave, but I really appreciate your attendance and your support. We're really thrilled that we're continuing this effort.
Okay. Anybody has to leave now, go, and then we'll start talking. While you folks are leaving, I want to tell you something, which couldn't be in the talk. But it's, if you read Tidal, the Occupier's journal, you'll see this. You know, the person who actually put the New Deal together, everything, Social Security, everything, Medicare, was a woman. She was Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's labor secretary, right? And as a graduate student, I was at Cornell awarded the first lodging scholarship, because, you know, I was a good cultural risk, the first lodging scholarship for a woman in this honor society called Telluride House, where Madam Perkins, Roosevelt's labor secretary, was the permanent faculty resident. So I lived, we were 2 women living in a house with 32 male undergraduates and 3 male graduate students. I was in my 20s, she was in her 80s. But we lived across the hallway, one from the other. And I did write there that I do feel that the fact that she was a feminist, deeply committed woman helped her create that model of a state which would, in fact, be responsible to the suffering poor. Because I don't believe that there is anything essential in being a woman to be nurturing, etc. But historically, the very smart women were still she was in her 80s and the 60s, right? Were still in the position of not being competitive with men in the world outside, kept from competing, always obliged to be responsible to the world at large in an enforced way. That was supposed to be womanliness. And also in polite society, idealized in a certain way. This kind of historical production produced in the, paradoxically, produced in this incredibly brilliant woman whom even her mother had told that she wasn't altogether good looking. Imagine that. So produced, and in fact this was anybody who's seen her picture knows that this was ridiculous. But she always said, Francis, wear this kind of a hat because the top of your head is narrower than the bottom. Imagine that. So at any rate, I do believe that there was something in the way in which women were brought up at that point. Of course, that is not the case right now. It's paradoxical that it's not the case, but it is, by and large, it's not altogether gone, that it allowed her to have the imagination to persist in creating out of whole cloth something that changed the look of the United States and saved the poor. So I just say this, of course, from 83, this thing has been broken down. Trickle-down economics, et cetera, But nonetheless, while you were waiting to settle yourself, I thought I would steal an extra minute or two to remind, I've been speaking of Carlos Monsiváis, my hero, but Madam Perkins is also my hero. I was greatly fortunate in coming into contact with her early. Now.
Anybody else want to come up? Professor Spivak, thank you very much for coming. I think one of the issues that you didn't address directly that is part of our moment here in Arizona is multilingualism. Tucson is a city that speaks English, Tohono O'odham, Spanish, sign language, German, many other languages. And yet, I think from a national perspective, Arizona is seen as as a monoculturalized or monolingualized place. You and Judith Butler wrote a short book, I think in 2006, called "Does the Nation?"
Who Sings the Nation?
Who Sings the Nation? Thank you. So, and when you were talking about golden ageism, I was thinking that maybe some of our concepts about what multilingualism is or monolingualism are also somewhat golden ageist. And have they changed in the last couple of years? And I ask this because Confluence is also going to be supporting a symposium on multilingualism in April. And after your talk, I was thinking, wow, I wish that you could participate, but I thought maybe you might be able to instead give us some beginning ideas of how your thinking about multilingualism has changed in the last couple of years.
Now, I will certainly, this is a very, very important question, and it is true, I was so wanting to talk about performatives and capital that I didn't touch on it. But could you just take a minute and tell me how you think multilingualism and monolingualism, our views are somewhat golden ageist? Just take a minute, and then I'll answer.
Okay. Well, I think that monolingualism has been changing. It's been changing with the internet technology that's able to produce content and distribute content from English into hundreds of other, quote, national languages instantaneously. When you made the comment that your piece that's going to be coming out in India, we probably would not end up reading it for an awfully long time. That's a question of distribution and translation and what types of texts tend to travel better than others given their place of publication, their language of publication, how they're distributed, etc. So I think some of those things have radically changed in the last 20 years, if not the last 10 years. And also we're having this new movement in Germany, in the US, in France, to kind of engage in a type of post or pan-ethnic monolingualism, where certain problems of migration, immigration, or integration, as they talk about it in Germany, are solved by saying, you know, all of these problems of Islamophobia or of intolerance are going to be solved if we all speak the same pan-ethnic lingua franca in a given country. So those are some of the ways that I think things have been changing a lot.
That's what you're calling golden ages, right? That if we spoke one language, all the problems would disappear. Is that it?
Well, it's almost a reinvestment in those golden ageist ideas that started up here in the US in around World War I. And then they loosened a bit in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, and then saw a real reinvestment in monolingualism as a civic technology with the Obama administration and with Angela Merkel, Sarkozy, and others. So if it is golden ageist, it's kind of a neo-golden ageist.
Wow, we're making theory here. But,
All right, I'm going to go sit down now.
Anyway, so yes, now let me give you, I mean, obviously, what we need to do is to be engaged in discussion. So I'll just give you a one-shot thing, and if we were actually sitting around talking, then each of us, as you well know, would be changing a little and so on. So I'll just give what I think here. Now, I feel that the idea that there is a usefulness in a language with which one can communicate internationally has been around. It's not just today. It's not a change. I mean, I can't now tell you how long it's been around, but let me cite a recent thing. And my example here is neither the United States nor Europe, but Africa, where this need was felt more. And I would cite the text that I'm sure many in this room know, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. Now, Ngugi's notion there was that we need English in Kenya, a result of, you know, like the enabling violation of imperialism, to quote myself, and nobody picks me up on that one because it's it's a scary thing, and there's bad faith in saying that it wasn't. And on the other hand, who wants to say that? See, that's also a kind of golden ageism. Enabling violation, a rape which produced a child. So the Ngugi says that yes, it is necessary, a historical contingency. Not so contingent, but okay. And then he goes on to say it is also true that within the African context, we need some big languages, you know, like Yoruba, Swahili, etc., Gikuyu in his case, etc. I can't do the click, but Hosa, and so on. But the thing is that in the context of, so that's not a bad idea. But on the other hand, when I was talking about using the digital, the Harvard University Press has just put a little horrible book-selling YouTube by me, of me talking about using the digital, but you know, if you want to watch it, you'll see I'm saying the same thing there. Using the digital so that it's on tap rather than on top, it seems to me that the fact that it has these broad languages, that's not anything. It's not a difference in kind from that old idea. That, I mean, even international socialism, which died for reasons that we can't discuss now, even that would have required some broad, big languages. Pan-Africanism was in English. So, okay. But the fact is that that's a kind of world governance idea. The digital is much more inclined towards this kind of world governance kind of idea, and keeping and suggesting that just crowding is democracy. So on the other side, it seems to me we cannot forget, and this is in my Rethinking Comparativism essay, that every language, if it is a language, is in fact capable of being a first language. You work on language acquisition. And the first language that is learned, whatever your theory of acquisition, there are many, and I don't have a favorite, but nobody can deny that it is learned before reasonableness kicks in. It's not learned from a grammar book. It's not the first language. Whatever, it can be more than one. A first language can be a conglomerate. So I'm not going to go into, especially since there's an expert sitting here, I'm not going to give my own version of what happens. I've written about it. You know, fools rush in. But what I am going to say, that however the first language is learned, since it is not learned through reasonable grammar learning, memorizing, and so on, well, however, I'm learning Chinese now for 7 years, so I kind of know how languages are taught. I didn't learn English like this. But however it is learned, it makes use of the psychic mechanism that is meta-psychological, that is not accessible to the psychology of the infant. The psychology of the infant, I mean, any parent knows, is not developed enough to be able to understand what's going on with, I mean, experts will write about it. The infant can't write about it. So what's happening is that the meta-psychological circuits of the human being are being activated. So that's how the ethical system, ethical semiosis, the sign system of the ethical, starting with a plus and a minus, you know, the breast and the phallus and so on. I'm not going to go into all of that, but that's how it's created. So if we, in fact, suggest that ethical problems, that people can be trained into the ethical by simply having a few broad languages, we are giving in to what we affectionately call rat choice, rational choice, which Kant calls bloße und mere reason, morally lazy. I think to an extent that is a contradictory position, a double-bind position. And so therefore, what we have to do is, even as we recognize the importance of some broad languages transforming themselves into different kinds of forms while the standard wants to remain strong, at the same time, we supplement this. And remember, to supplement means to introduce the dangerous element of the incalculable. We supplement this by the absolute fact that the world's wealth of languages, some are going to die naturally, that's a different thing. The world's wealth of languages, in fact, produce the ethical. About Africa, one more thing I'll say. Do you realize that today in Africa, you cannot teach mother tongues in schools, not because, and I mean, of course, for the demands of global demands, yes, but also because the mother tongues are spoken just by the primary school teacher, so you can learn them in the primary school. But by the time you come into high school, in Nairobi, let's say, you are, in fact, learning the big languages, big African languages, and English, and whatever the imperial language was. But because of the digital, what we can now do, I was saying, I mean, so that even those who speak the mother tongue, you know, the PhDs in economics, sociology, etc., one understands 30%, the other understands 40%, because they have not been grammatized. Now, today we can think of these as a miraculous preservation rather than a problem because of IT. So that new universities like the Kwara State, which is going to start this, anybody wants a job, a linguist wants a job, there's one. So they are going to make a database of all of these mother tongues so that it becomes not just an African consortium, but an international consortium. So the digital can give us tools to defeat the digital, as it were. That's supplementation. So therefore, I will say that the idea of preserving the world's wealth of languages so that there can be a world, not just globality, is something that you liked in my third chapter. So that, and finally I will say, the fact that it's getting published in India is not necessarily a thing to mourn, because there are now independent publishers who are fighting, as Canto Vivo hoped the young generation would, the children of the people would fight, who are fighting the fact that the conglomerates are suffering because of the digital, right? My publisher, Seagull, in India, and Elliott Bay in Seattle, various publishers, they are located in places that, not world distribution, but they're gaining world distribution. What you read, Judith Butler and me, who published it? Seagull, which is based in Calcutta. How did it get world distributed? Because they're also trying to turn around this, and Seagull is just starting, if I may just do a little bit of publicity and then take another question. The Norwegian government has given it funds to start a school for publishing so that anyone in any language can in fact be subsidized to go to Calcutta of all places and learn how to start a small enterprise in publishing in the languages of the world. So, struggle is happening. I agree with you, but then I would add this, and I'm sorry I can't be here in April.
Hello. Hello, Gayatri. Thanks so much for coming. I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm surprised there aren't more people asking questions. It was very stimulating. Let me just say that I really want to affirm and agree with you about the education of having an educated, about the importance of having an educated electorate. And as a teacher, you know, here at the University of Arizona, it's not always easy, but I think it's extremely important work to be doing. I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask you to say a little bit more about trying to think globally and how that works with a post-colonial mindset. Can we have them both? If you could say a little bit more about the effort of thinking globally and holding on to some aspects of the post-colonial or not. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very important and very difficult question, okay? Because post-colonial is not something that I'm ready to write off. And as I said again and again, I'm myself much more committed to the post-colonial because of the accident of my birth. You know, the place and the time. We were the first first post-colonial generation, as adolescents, which is a very, very sensitive time. We actually imbibed the generalizations of what was basically Nehruvian Fabian socialism, and so we understood the world in a certain different way. It's hard for me to, not necessarily always the US version or the Latin American version, but that homely version of the new nation coming up in terms of post-coloniality. That is something that is, to me, not yet ready to be buried. On the other hand, I therefore can see that the post-colonial model, especially given that Javier told me yesterday a story about demographic frontiers and the avatar, etc., that it left me gasping. But in my own way, I've been suggesting for some time that it's not related to this biometric stuff, that given migrant populations, especially in the way in which migrant populations, Indian migrant populations, which are in a different class category generally, not altogether, but somehow, in the United States, given the way they actually influence elections in India, and of course all the money that goes into the states into the states of origin from the places where labor works, that frontiers have become virtualized now, and they're not just the geographed conflictual borders that we know. So therefore, the idea of the post-colonial, which comes from territorial imperialism, is a little bit, you see, and that's what, in fact, the state terrorists are thinking in issuing those Senate bills and the Congress bills, that in fact this is an old territorial, post-colonial kind of rising with the Mexican Americans becoming too educated for their own good, and with the Mexican studies thing. So I think, however, that most of us, including Carlos Monsiváis, would think that to think in a post-colonial way, Israel is here an anomaly. Unfortunately, it is in a place which is not in keeping with the world. So to that extent, I think we cannot just think post-colonially, because in some ways, I think my friends, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, made a bit of a mistake because they needed a reality check. They were not really involved globally when they wrote these books, that with globalization, what we are getting is post-colonial, digitalized multitudes. This is wrong. And so I have a feeling that we need to change the idea of the post-colonial. Don't throw it away. Make it a tough residual, but change it. Think, as I said, okay, this thing will be much better than me just yakking away. It's an example. I was in Nigeria on their Independence Day, and I was talking. And I said, you are not just 51 years old. Independence came 51 years ago, and they were all saying 51 years old. In fact, on the other hand, if you go back to what there was before you were imperialized so that you could be independent, that's not so good either. See, that's sometimes the kind of, Nehru discovering India. That's not so good either. What you have to do now is think the old in a new way and think the new in an old way. So that's a little bit different from the merely post-colonial, the new nation coming in, because the new nation is now not constitutionally accountable, but rather in managerial in an outflow of global capital, as I was saying. I'm saying this as an ignorant person, but I'm not saying something that I don't know. Ignorant I am, but I still know this, because there are people who actually want to make it their business, economists, to make this clearer to people like me. So therefore, I think the idea of the post-colonial doesn't quite fit what's happening globally. On the other hand, the attitudes which gave rise to the post-colonial are not something that we should kill. I hope this is an answer that you can work with. If not, we can talk more.
Hi, Dr. Spivak. Thank you for your talk. I'm over here. I'm lucky to sit in the first row. I can easily come towards the mic without too much nervousness. But I just wanted to bring up, you've touched on some recent legislation, which is great because it makes us consider these longue durée things happening in Arizona, that are beneath the surface all the time and really just kind of erupting in these types of policies. And I wanted to get your feedback and ideas on one of the longer term problems that we've had in Arizona, which are the deaths in the desert over the past 10 years of migrants trying to cross to come here. So through these borders that you say must be maintained through capital, then there's these deaths, at least 2,000 of which we've had here handled by this local medical examiner's office in Tucson. My question for you is, you're talking about moving from the performative to the performance, and how do we do this when there is impunity and death? And how do we move into to thinking in the now, I can't remember, the to come, the imperative, when there's impunity and there's policy that's causing such violations of human rights?
Thank you. I would be a fool to offer you, and here as a visitor, offer you a definitive answer to this, but I certainly acknowledge the importance of your question. Now, I will say what I said to the South Asians, because they were talking about subaltern performative. I said to them, we cannot be performative in a subaltern way because we are not subalterns. So we in this room, however we have been disenfranchised, the fact that we are sitting here makes it clear that we are not subalterns. In that arena where you're talking about people crossing and dying, this is where Monsiváis is very, very useful. And I will again first answer with a story. Not the last, but the one before that, World Economic Forum, CNN was interviewing various people, and they were all being, as they are, I mean, these are secret operations that go on in order to organize and in order to secure this kind of inflow-outflow that I'm talking about. And they also, so they're all being very nice. Of course, they're very nice. I mean, they really want to be nice to every minority and so on and so forth. And they were saying this. They also talked to the director of the ILO. And he said, it's not a question of being nice. This exodus would not be so great if, in fact, global capital wanted to pay some attention to local economic situations. I mean, he was hitting his head against a wall, but he knew what he was talking about. He gave a very simple answer. And I'll tell you, all of the other answers were looped as they are on CNN. I happened to catch this one. This one was not looped. And this is of course also tied to the kind of cultural imaginary that is constructed, which then it's very hard to let go. And that imaginary, you know, the idea of North America as the place of modernity, that is described. It's not only the situation within the local capital situation in Mexico, but also this cultural imaginary also drives. It's not just the idea of a better life because life here is worse, but this imaginary that Monsiváis, I'm so unhappy that I could not actually just talk to him cannot talk to him now one-on-one on this issue, because it's really something that needed to be tracked between us. How does one, this is why I'm talking about changing mindset, how does one connect the two? One being this knowledge in the metropolitan minority of what's really happening globally, that's where I was, you know, in the end. And the other being the rearrangement of desires. I mean, I'm engaged in this in India now for 25 years, and I hardly make headway. The rearrangement of the imaginary, rearrangement, uncoercive rearrangement of desires, so that this particular imaginary is not at work. You know, when Du Bois wrote in Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois is my hero, what can I say? I mean, there are many problems with his gender politics, but he really saw very clearly something. When he wrote in Dusk of Dawn about the Negro, as he called him, right after emancipation, that, you know, he must be, and he, of course in him, must be fed and clothed, food and shelter, yes, but also communicate with the stars. What was he talking about? That there had also to be not just needs, but also this change in mindset right from the start. So I would say with great modesty, because I do not have really the right to answer this kind of a question, I'm not a subaltern. I cannot engage in subaltern performance. But I would say that by and large, this is what can be discussed. But a discussion in a room of this sort will not go far. I myself think, and I have said this to someone yesterday, yes, in class, because I won't tell you why. But in class, I was saying that if a text is simply texere, textile, something woven, then the text of working is a different language from the text of reading. They are two different kinds of texts. And so I can talk a great deal about that because I've tried to engage myself in both. And it is in that other text that one can have the courage to propose an answer, because answers written in a book by me may be praised and I will get a good name. But as to whether that kind of an answer can actually be implemented, and will people have the courage to implement it and the patience to implement it and face the failure that will come as a result of trying to dislodge the imaginary at once as one is trying to do something in the field of the flow, in and outflow of capital, that you cannot say from the success of a book. So this is an answer, but it's an answer coming from a professor at a university to an anguished question. Those are the limits of my answer. Excuse me for keeping you waiting.
That's okay. This is less anguished. It's coming back to the point about an informed electorate. Some of the most informed things that I've heard recently and which touch on points that have been made here today. I wanted to ask you what you think of the future of and the present of the Occupy movement, because the demographic that made the decisive difference in the last election, these are some of the most informed, well-informed people that you hear nowadays, don't want to participate in electoral politics and are talking about other ways of solving the problems.
Ms. Electoral, thank you. It's a question that I worry about. Unlike that question, there is something I can involve myself with. The electorate I didn't really say this was a very, very interesting misstatement you made. I get it. I wasn't talking about information. I was not saying informed, because information is not, and in fact, the piece that I've written for them, What is to be done, there is a sentence which says, it is not just a question of getting sufficient information. I'm talking about creating a will to social justice, which is not just for oneself, not self-interest. So this is a very different thing, you know, creating an educated electorate where education means training the reflex for the ethical. The reflex for the ethical, not like I must do the right thing. That's bloße Vernunft. But in fact, but let me just say something, then you can come back. I like dialogues, but let me just finish this.
Sure.
So,
no, I'm just happy to substitute educated for
okay, fine. It is not a simple substitution because it goes around it. That the informed may want not to use the electoral system. But what I'm trying to say to them, and I stayed up, imagine I'm going to 70 next month, I don't behave like this, but there was so little time, and there was so little time, and I had to get this because I'm reading the graduate applications, which is probably confidential, anyway, forget it. But the thing is that I stayed up until 4:58 in the morning, all night. I've not done that since I was a graduate student for working. I mean, of course, you have to when you're traveling. But I stayed up to finish this thing. And it was too long. It's 2,600 words. They want 2,200 or 2,000. They've just sent me some editings. And so humble, but I can't look at it until day after tomorrow. But anyway, so that's what I say to them. I say to them that, you know, just electoral politics is not going to do it. It is true that most Northern Democrats are more into a regulated situation, and more Republicans are into, and then I've given those metaphors that I was saying, that, you know, like any time the state wants to serve, they say the state wants to control. It's metaphorical. So you have to, you know, understand what is actually happening. It's neither service nor control. What's happening? Anyway, so what I was saying was that just electoral politics is not going to help because, as we see, the state itself is, in fact, trying to keep this big global system moving. On the other hand, given that this border, I'm very glad you asked the question, the performative contradiction of borderlessness, that the borderless has to keep borders of a different sort, not geographical borders, India and China fighting, no. Of a different sort, internal borders, not just class and caste and gender and so on, but this difference, you know, which is capital intensive. They are information intensive, this kind of thing, right? They have all the information in the world and they need it. So this is something that has to clue into electoral politics. You cannot just simply vote and expect, because that expectation does not relate to the individual people elected, because they're in the hands of something bigger. And so I contrasted the situation from What is to be done of Lenin's, and I said, you know, the times have changed. Vanguardism has in fact not been able to produce anything like a socially just world. So I take your point. I'm very sympathetic with it, that I can go on for so long about grounding errors here. You would ask me to shut up, and I am asking myself to shut up. But because that's really classroom talk or political rally talk, or, you know, that's not question and answer. But it's a very important question. Yes, I discourage people from just simply saying, no, we won't vote. There are no other ways, because what it has to be, like I said to you, the big languages supplemented with that incalculable. Here also, with the will to social justice for all, not just self-interest for my group, the electoral politics cannot be thrown away. But the electoral politics has to be, even the Supreme Court is tied to a constitutionality that's dated. So that electoral politics has to be supplemented with this other kind of work. But hard. Well, and I'm certainly too old, and you don't look to me like a very youthful prankster either. So, let's hope.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow at noon we have a follow-up seminar in the Student Union Agave Room, and I advise you to get there early because it's not a big room. But that will provide an opportunity for continuing the conversation, and we're also going to Nogales in the morning, so that'll be very interesting to see what kind of reactions we can get from Professor Spivak. And so thank you again. We appreciate your support, and again, we're going to gather at the College of Architecture main floor, and you're welcome to join us right across the street. Thank you very much.